It's interesting to think that right below where you're standing right now, or sitting, there might be people walking around, carrying out their daily activities. And like we always think about outer space, we always think about the bottom of the ocean, these places that are unexplored, but we don't typically think about what's in the underground. We don't typically think about what's beneath us. And if you read enough paranormal literature, you will come across these cases of underground, cities, whole civilizations living underneath the earth. In 1956, Ralph B. Fields and his best friend Joe became interested in collecting bat guano, or bat droppings, after reading about its value in a magazine. At the time, they were living near a small town called Manson in Tehama County in California. They thought that given the area, it might be a good place to go exploring for such material, as there were a lot of caves in the nearby hills. After talking it over for some time, and as we had plenty of time just then, we decided to take a little trip up the country just back of us. As we were almost at the foot of Mount Lassen, that seemed the best place to conduct our little prospecting tour. The two friends gathered some light camping gear and a couple of small pup tents, and they started on what they expected to be a 3 or 4 day jaunt up the mountain. I guess we covered about 10 or 12 miles on the third day, and it was fast approaching time to begin to look for a place to spend the night. And the thought was not very amusing, and it had turned a little colder, and we were well over 7,000 feet above sea level. We soon found a sheltered place beneath a large outcrop of rock, and set up making a camp. As I was always the cook and Joe the chore boy, I began getting things ready to fix us some grub, and Joe began digging around for some dead scrub brush to burn. I had things all ready and looking around for Joe and his firewood, but I could see no signs of him. At this point, Ralph called out to Joe but got no response. Soon Joe appeared from around the rock where they had set up camp for the evening. Ralph could tell he was excited about something, as his face was, quote, lit up like a Christmas tree. He had found a cave. The entrance was on the other side of that very rock. He was all for exploration right away, but I argued that we'd better wait till morning. But he argued that in the cave it was always night, and we would have to use flashlights anyway, so what would be the difference? Well, we finally decided we would give it at least a once-over after we had a bite to eat. After consuming the food, the two men, still slightly exhausted from the day hike, decided to check out the entrance Joe had discovered. It wasn't much to call a cave at first, as it had a very small entrance, but back about 20 feet it widened out to about 10 feet wide and around 8 feet high, and it did reach back a considerable distance, as we would see at least 100 yards, and it appeared to bend off to the left. We followed to the bend, and again we could see a long way ahead and down. At this point we became a little afraid, as we were some way into the mountain. The idea of being inside so far seemed to make us a little afraid. But we reasoned that inasmuch as there were no branches or connecting caves, we could not get lost and therefore had nothing to be afraid of. So we went on. As Joe and Ralph moved deep into the cave, they found no trace of bat guano, nor anything to indicate that any animal had ever been or was still inside this cave. I don't know how far we went, but it must have been a mile or two as we kept on walking, and the cave never changed its contour or size. Noticing this, I mentioned it to Joe. We stopped to examine closer by the light of our larger flashlights. We discovered an amazing thing. The floor seemed to be worn smooth, as though it had been used for a long time as a path or road. The walls and ceiling of the cave seemed to be cut like a tunnel. It was a solid rock, and we knew that no one would cut a tunnel there out of rock, as there had been no sign of mining operations. And the rock in the walls and ceiling was run together like it had been melted or fused from a great heat. As the two men examined the cave walls, Joe suddenly took notice of something ahead of them. Joe swore he saw a light way down in the cave. We started down the cave once more and found a light, or should I say the light found us as it was suddenly flashed into our faces. We stood there blinded by it for a minute until I flashed my light at its source and saw we were confronted by 3 men. These men looked to be about 50 or a little younger. They were dressed in ordinary clothes such as is worn by most working men in that locality. Levi-type pants and flannel shirts and wool coats. They wore no hats, but their shoes looked strange as their soles were so thick they gave the impression of being made of wood. We just stood there for a minute or two and looked at them. We had no idea there was anybody within miles of us, and there stood 3 men looking at us in a cave a mile or so in the depths of old Mount Lassen. To make matters worse for Ralph and Joe, neither were carrying anything that could be used as a weapon. I was scared. We were unarmed, and we knew nothing about these men. One of them spoke to us. He asked us what we were looking for. I told him, bat guano, but I could see he didn't believe it. We both tried to convince him, but he just smiled. We had a little argument with him, but fearing they might be some criminal gang in hiding, we came to the conclusion that we'd better retreat. As Ralph and Joe turned to leave, they discovered that their exit was blocked. 2 men of equal size and appearance suddenly emerged out of the darkness and confronted them. I can't find any way to express the fear and utter helplessness I felt in finding our retreat cut off. One of these strangers told us, "I think maybe you better come with us." We were in no position to argue, though we both would have liked to do a little of that right there, but we had no way of enforcing our arguments. So we permitted the 5 to escort us deeper into the depths of old Mount Lassen. The 2 men were led, Ralph guessed, a couple miles when they came to something that truly amazed them. We came to a place where the cavern widened out a little and we saw some kind of machine, if it can be called that. Though I had no chance to examine it closely at the time, I did later, and it was a very strange contrivance. It had a very flat bottom, but the front was curved upwards, something like a toboggan. The bottom plate was about 8 inches thick, and it was the color of pure copper, but it was very hard-tempered. Although I've had a lot of experience with metal and alloys, I had no opportunity to examine it closely enough to determine just what it was. I doubt very much if I could. Ralph claims that it had a seat in front directly behind a heavy dashboard. There was a dial shaped in a semicircle with figures or markings on it. Ralph had no idea what they meant, but he admits they were very easy to recall. If there was a motor, it was in the rear. All I could see was 2 horseshoe or magnet-shaped objects that faced each other with the round parts to the outside. When this thing was in operation, a brilliant green arc seemed to leap between the 2, and to continue to glow as long as it was in operation. The only sound it gave off was a hum or buzz that sounded like a battery charger in operation. The seat in front was very wide. The only method of operation was a black tear-shaped object which hung from the panel by a chain. One of these men sitting in the middle took this thing and touched the sharp end to the first figure on the left side of the dial. When he touched the first figure, the contraption seemed to move almost out from under us. But it was the smoothest and quietest takeoff I ever experienced. We seemed to float. Not the slightest sound or vibration. After they traveled for about a minute, Ralph observed the man touch the next figure on the dial, and the speed of the vehicle increased at an alarming rate. When he moved the black object over past the center of the dial, the speed increased to such an extent that Ralph and Joe found it hard to breathe. I can't begin to estimate the distance we had traveled or our speed, but it was terrific. The two horseshoe objects in the rear created a green light that somehow shone far ahead of us, lighting up the cavern for a long way. I soon noticed a black line running down the center of the cavern, and our inner mountain taxi seemed to follow that. I don't know how long we continued our mad ride, but it was long enough for us to become used to the terrific speed, and we had just overcome our fear of some kind of wreck when we were thrown into another spasm of fear. Ralph observed that, off in the distance approaching them head-on, was another vehicle of the same type. I could see that our captors were very nervous, but our speed continued. As the other machine became closer, our speed slowed down very fast, and we came to a smooth stop 2 feet from the front of the other machine. As soon as the two vehicles stopped, Ralph noted that their captors leaped out and began running away. A fine blue pencil beam of light suddenly emerged from the machine and swept across, cutting them down one by one. At this point, the figures dismounted from the other machine and walked up to Ralph and Joe, who were still seated in their captor's vehicle. I noticed they carried a strange object in their hands. It resembled a fountain pen flashlight with a large, round bulb-like affair on the back end and a grip something like a German Luger. They pointed them at us. After seeing what had happened to our erstwhile captors, I thought that our turn was next, whatever it was, but one spoke to us. "Are you surface people?" "I guess we are, as this is where we came from recently." "Where did the Horlocks find you?" "If you mean those guys there, back there a few hundred miles." "You are very fortunate that we came this way. You would have also become Horlocks, and then we would have had to execute you also." This was the first time I realized that the others were deceased. With that, the men put their weapons away, and Ralph noted that their attitude changed. They seemed friendlier and willing to help. Apparently this was not the first time they had been involved in a situation like this. I ventured to ask them the who and why of everything we had run into. I told them of our search for guano and how we had encountered the 5 Horlocks, as he called them, and also asked him about the machines and their operation, and could we get out again. He smiled and told us, "I could not tell you too much as you would not understand. There are so many things to explain, and you could not grasp enough of what I could myself tell you. The people on the surface are not ready to have the things that the ancients have left. Neither I nor anyone in any of the caverns know why these things work, but we do know how to operate some of them." Ralph noted that the man indicated that there were, quote, evil people who were hell-bent on making life unpleasant for them and for the surface dwellers. They are safe because no one on the surface believes us or them. That is why I am telling you this. No one would believe that we exist. We would not care, but there are many things here that the outer world must not have until they are ready to receive them, as they would completely destroy themselves. So we must make sure that they do not find them. Regarding the machines for which they rode in on, the man indicated that they still had not figured out what makes them work, only that they know how to operate them. They seem to understand that it worked utilizing gravity, and can move forward and in reverse. The bottom plate of it is always raised about 4 inches above the surface of the ground. That is why there is no friction, Ralph guessed. Why it moves so smoothly. The object suspended from this chain is pure carbon. It is the key to the entire operation. As I told you before, I cannot explain why it runs, but it does. We want you to return to where you came from and forget about us. We will show you how to operate the sled, and we want you never again to enter the cave. If you do, and you do not encounter the Horlocks, we will have to do something about you ourselves. so it would not be advisable to try to return at all. One thing I can tell you, we never could permit you to leave another time. The man proceeded to show Ralph and Joe how to operate the machine, including how to reverse its direction. They thanked the men and then seated themselves in the sled, as they called it. Our return trip was really something we enjoyed, as I was sure not to advance the carbon far enough on the dial to give us such terrific speed. But we soon found ourselves where we started from. The sled slid to a smooth stop, and we jumped out and started up the cave afoot. We must have walked a long way coming in, for we thought we'd never come to the surface, but at last we did, and it was late afternoon the next day when we emerged. The men wasted little time making their way down the mountain. Joe indicated that he had no interest in ever returning, whilst Ralph was curious about what other wonders might be lurking down there. What is the answer to the whole thing? I would like to know. We have been told just enough for me to believe that down there somewhere there were and are things that might baffle the greatest minds of this earth. This case was actually covered in an episode of Mysteries in the National Parks, Season 2, Episode 3. They did an episode about on Mount Lassen. And they did briefly cover this case. They just kind of showed how these two men were in this underground cavern, and they encountered these three men who basically asked them if they were surface people. And they didn't really go into it much beyond that. So I really kind of wanted to, delve into it a little bit. It's just something I found a little odd. Is he says they went into this cave and it was around dusk. They were making supper. It sounds like they were in there for at least 24 hours. But when you read the story, it doesn't sound like they were in there that long. So did he forget? Like, is there stuff that he doesn't remember about the experience? Or did the duration actually last 24 hours? Were they just going that deep into the... I don't know, it just seems like a discrepancy. I don't know if it's intentional. It just sounds like he doesn't... It sounds like a typical ET encounter case where there's parts of the encounter that the witness just doesn't recall. And it doesn't even seem odd to them.